John Caesar is thought to be the first black African to ever reach Australia. Now, I'll tell you why it's not likely that he's the first, and that black Africans in a very small number, very small, we're talking maybe five, six, or seven, had actually probably reached Australia by the ninth century. But we'll come back to that. First, let's talk about John Caesar. See, John Caesar was a slave from Madagascar. He was born in Madagascar, captured, and then sent to um, the Americas. In the Americas, he found a way to free himself by going to England. In England, he became a thief and was arrested a couple times and then sent to Australia. And basically, he lived a crazy life. Now, I don't need to go into the full details of this person yet. We're going to make a dedicated video to him. But it's important to mention this because, first of all, this is where they say the first African to reach Australia was or is. But this is not true, or at least most evidence makes it obvious that it's not true. We do not know the names of the first Africans to reach Australia. We do not know the names of the first Africans to reach close to Australia. But we do know that Africans went there frequently. Not Australia, but close to Australia. In fact, it is thought that the Madagascans, who John Caesar was part of, only arrived in Madagascar because of this trade. So, what am I talking about here? Well, first, let's start off with a quote. The challenge of the discovery of Australia is associated with Australia over the course of centuries. Even from ancient times, however, little is known or has been forgotten about the sophisticated historical era in which the Muslim seafarers or different backgrounds participated in the rediscovery of Australia and cultural religious interactions. This scholarship, for the first time, brings much significance in the interesting information from a wide range of sources revealing the early Muslim exploration of Australia and an Islamic contribution to the riches of the early Australian multi-religious history. The periods of the history span from the 8th to the 15th century, expanding until the beginning of the 20th century. The book documents that Australia was rediscovered by the medieval Arab and Persian scholar in 820 and 934. The book explores the evidence for the continuous visits to Australia over the course of centuries by different Muslim ethnicities, such as the Zangi, which is the black Africans, the Baijini, the Omani, Indian, Chinese, Malay, Indonesians, prior to the 15th century. The range of evidence of the Muslim discovery of Australia includes Islamic maps, Muslim astrological measures and remarks, their adventuring and trading, a variety of cultural religious interactions, richness and etymology, exchanging of ideas, skills and experiences, as well as aboriginal painting. Thus, transoceanic seafaring, firstly from Arabia, Africa, Canton, and India, then to Malaysia and the Indonesian archipelago, along with the spice route to the Spice Islands, then to New Guinea, Australia in the period of the 8th century to the end of the 15th century, in a variety of ways, confirms that the great contribution of the early Muslims in the part of the world and in Australian history is this book reveals the important but unknown dimensions that the Muslim discovery of Australia occurred at the same time when Islam appeared among in the world's many regions. Now, in order for you to understand what I'm talking about, you have to understand the landscape, you have to understand the oceans. But why am I highlighting Indonesia and not Australia? Well, for the most part, Indonesia is spoken about in word, and the word of the day is Sumatra. Sumatra is this part of Indonesia. So why do we care? Well, it's because as early as Marco Polo, Sumatra is mentioned by Marco Polo and by his contemporaries and by Muslims and by other people. The trade that came down here, written by all of these people, is said to circulate from East Africa, Australia, India, China, and the Middle East. Now, the people that are not that fascinating when it comes to them reaching Australia are like the Chinese and the Indonesians because they're so close. But that history has also been forgotten because people talk about the discovery in the 1500s, the first Europeans to land in Australia. Now, 1500s is a little too early, so let's be specific. 1606 is the first time they discover Australia. The word that Marco Polo uses for Sumatra, the region that I just showed you, which in some places he calls it Sutra, is Java, and you will see as I show you. Departing from Ziamba and steering between south and southeast 1500 miles, you reach an island of a great size named Java, which according to the reports of the same well-informed navigators is the largest in the world, being in circuit above 300 miles. It is under the dominion of the king only, nor do the inhabitants pay tribute to any other power. They are worshippers of idols. The country abounds with rich commodities, like pepper, nutmegs, spikenard, galangal, cubobs, cloves, and all the other valuable spices and drugs are the produce of the island, which occasion is to be visited by many ships laden with merchandise, that yields to the owners considerable profit. The quantity of gold collected there exceeds all calculation and belief from thence. It is that the merchant of Zaiten and of Manji in general have imported and to this day import the metal to a great amount, and from thence also is obtained the greatest part of the spices that are distributed throughout the world. That the great Khan has not brought the island under subjugation to him must be attributed to the length of the voyage and the dangers of navigation. Now, interestingly, the word Java is still used today in Indonesia, and you also have Sumatra, which, like I said, he said Suatra, which is a wrong name. But then you also have Borneo, which the people suggest that Kubla Khan, or the Khan at the time, the Grand Khan, sent a voyage of people to come and investigate this island. But of course, like Marco Polo said earlier, he did not send an army down here because it was so far away from where he could go and take over that he just needed to find out about it. Now, obviously, and I think we need to make a dedicated video on Genghis Khan. Obviously, Genghis Khan had a mission to take over the whole world, but clearly he knew that this place was out of reach. But this shows that the Indonesians were in the picture. In fact, they've been in the picture for hundreds of years before this. The periplus of the Erythraean Sea mentions one of the islands of Indonesia by a very similar name to Java and even the direction. But here's the thing, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea seems to have gotten the information from Indian merchants or Indians who talked about it. This means this wouldn't have been a first-hand encounter. Just like Marco Polo, this is not a first-hand encounter for Marco Polo. But for the Muslims that told him about it, for the Africans that told the other people about it, and for the people of Genghis or the Khan that was alive at this time, for the Khan to transfer this information all the way back to that region, those were first hand accounts. And of course, what they report back was fascinating. From the BBC, when Islam came to Australia, few Australians are aware that the country's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people had regular contact with foreign Muslims long before the arrival of Christian colonizers, and Islam continues to exercise an appeal for some Aboriginal peoples today, writes Janak Rogers. The white lines are faint but unmistakable, small sailing boats, picked out in the white and yellow pigment on the red ochre to a Wellington range in Arnhem Land, Northern Australia, tell a different story from the one that most Australians accept as a history of their nation. They are traditional Indonesian boats known as praus, and they brought Muslim fishermen from the flourishing trading city of Makassar in search of trepang or sea cucumbers. Exactly when the Macassan first arrived is uncertain. Some historians say it was the 1750s, but radiocarbon dating of beeswax figures superimposed on the cave paintings suggests that it is much earlier. One of the figure appears to have been before 1664, perhaps as early as the 1500s. This is the picture or the cave painting of the boat, which is clearly, obviously, I mean, we're looking at two things. Let's use logic for a second. I don't like appealing to logic, but we're gonna do it. We're looking at two things going on right now. One, we're looking at a civilization that's still using cave painting, but what they're drawing is the prow or the Indonesian boat. And you can see here that it has sails. You can see the bottom of the boat. You can see a man standing far away. And you can also see vaguely that there's very tall people on this boat, but it's meant to be, smaller. But you can also see dotted around other sort of shapes and stuff. This is the first evidence of boats coming and landing in Australia from outside of Australia. So, in other words, not Australian made, not uh let's call them east of Australia boats. It's not that. It's people coming from the western side of Australia, meaning Muslims and others like the Zangi, as it was reported in the first one there. Now, I want to be certain here that I am not suggesting that Africans came here in great number. In fact, I'm pretty sure they didn't. They actually came in very small numbers, and the reason was because their main goal was to go in places much higher than Indonesia. But they did reach these places, and we know this because of certain types of bananas. Now, there are bananas that are local to this region, but there are certain types of bananas that are not. We know it because of other types of plants and stuff like that that has been sent both directions. What this does, though, it creates a curiosity about what type of ships were the Africans wielding at the time. Did they have sails? I mean, the suggestion by Al Masudi is that the people didn't have nails connecting their boats, not due to inability to make nails, but because they were corrosive in that part of the ocean. But here's the thing, they traveled this far and made it that far on their own, traveling to India, Indonesia, and then, of course, Australia, as the evidence is mounting, as the evidence is showing. See, if we only found evidence of Africans in Australia, or we only found evidence of them in one place like Indonesia and not Australia, this would be suspicious. It would be like, ah, the information is planted or something. But actually, we find this information everywhere. We find as close as Cambodia. So just above Indonesia, Cambodia, we find art, slaves, um, and food and spices that were traded from Africa all the way to Cambodia. Now this is where the evidence starts to get bigger and bigger, because obviously if the Swahili people can make it to Cambodia, what's stopping them from making it to Indonesia, which we have more evidence that they landed in Indonesia. So for anybody confused, let's first get back into the history of it so we know how the trade would have worked very easily. So you see here Sofala, Mozambique, Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Melinda, Mogadishu, Aden, and Cairo. These would be the big trading routes. And then, of course, there's Madagascar. And they would have taken the monsoons and the fast winds to try and go. Opportunity moment, go, let's go. And then they'd go there to Calicut, which is one of the biggest mentioned places that the Zanj traded with. We know that. Then we go down, and you can see how from Calicut they would travel into. So you see there how the map goes from Mombasa to there, and then there's a tie from there to Cambodia or to the Cambodian areas and to China. And so the Africans, the way they traded, the majority, this is the part that gets scary, the majority of their free trade, where they would not be considered slaves or whatever, was India, Indonesia, and all these other places, all these other lower Australian places. And this is where it gets interesting because, and this is why I mention this, is because from here, the trip to America is only a trip away. From Boston University, we read the Swahili Coast and the Indian Ocean trade. And I think we have to go to number 3. A long history of trade of various luxury goods as well as enslaved peoples set the region at the center of a global intercontinental networks linking the Swahili coast to the Arabian Peninsula, China, India, and Cambodia, among other places in the 15th century. In the 15th century, Europe via the Portuguese intrusion, and later the Dutch and British entered the matrix as pirates and as authoritarians seeking trade monopoly because Europe had nothing of great value to trade. It was only a couple years ago when historians were saying they had no idea how people had arrived in Madagascar and they couldn't find any evidence of boats and ships or any of that stuff. In fact, they had no idea how people from Africa had traveled to um, India or China because, again, they don't find early evidence of giant boats and stuff, but the evidence just keeps climbing just randomly. And a lot of it is happening where they didn't expect it. Indonesia, Australia, and all these other places depicting boats that we know are not native to those regions. So, what's happening? And also, they depict something that people didn't expect, which were giant sails and stuff like that. A lot of people were like, oh, yeah, the Swahilis before the Arabs arrived didn't use sails, but instead used whatever, like they would row. Now, rowing all the way to Australia is wild, but people didn't know. They thought they would just like hop from island to island. Now, that's out the window. The typical Swahili boat had a three-sided sail, and this triangular sail helped these people travel very far and wide. Now, it had a local name called Ado, but that's not that important. The thing that's very important is that we find boats being depicted both by Khoisan people, both by Tanzanians, both by all these people in rock art, especially, which is very important in Africa because we don't find a lot of canvas paintings. We don't find a lot of depictions like that of boats, and so finding them in rock art shows us their history. Now, some of the paintings are of local boats, meaning boats that you would use to go fish in small areas. And it's funny because the Khoisan, we think of them as like, oh, they're just people who live outside. But the Khoisan used to live by the shore, by the coasts. And living by the coasts, they made boats. This is a depiction of a boat by the Khoisan. So, as we can see, the people of Tanzania who are depicted like this is a recreation, but who are depicted like this found themselves moving far into the east and traveling there before Europeans did. And the story that we're told about who discovered this and discovered that is a completely different one. What we need to talk about, probably in another video, is did these people ever hear, talk, or anything about the Americans? Is it possible that maybe they didn't go there, but they heard about it from this side in East Africa? And did maybe the Chinese hear about it? Who heard about these people? Because you see how they're right next door to each other. And I need to make a video about that. I need to make a video about how the people who are in Australia, the people who are in Australia, their neighbors are the ones that went to the Americas at about the same time that these people are coming to them. It's a very, very interesting flow of movement. Now, a second thing we need to do is talk about people who doubt this trade or whatever. Now, I'm one of those people, like, I like to, wherever I believe something, I like to look at the opposite view. Just like when I look at the Moors, I go, were they black or were they white? Let me start off with the assumption that they were white, or let me start off with the assumption that they were black. And so what I did was I went and checked several universities to see the ones that doubted. And far from this, I'm actually seeing something very strange, which I've never seen before, which is like a race between the universities to put out information about this giant trade faster than other people. It seems like nobody really doubts it. It seems like the evidence is overwhelming. But I want to know exactly where can I find, and I'm gonna keep looking. Where can I find doubters? Because I need that information in my brain to make it seem more fair. Because if everybody believes it, that's when I'm gonna start doubting it. Yeah, as you can see here, this is a depiction of Africans traveling on boats, seeking fish. And here's a recreation of a badly damaged rock art from South Africa. This was redrawn because the original picture is just not visible anymore. So this depicts how they used to fish in the Khoisan regions. Now I want to be sure to state this: the Khoisan people are not the ones that were responsible. In a way, I mean, the Khoisan were also part of the Swahili coast, but the Khoisan necessarily as a whole were not the people who were responsible for this movement as much as it was the Bantus. Another question we should ask ourselves is what inspired this movement? What made it possible? Well, the monsoon would be a very good candidate Because if you had smaller boats and you were in the coasts of Africa or you were close to the waters in Africa, the Indian Ocean, at certain points, the waters and the winds would just take you to India without your permission. And you trying to sail away from that would be, good luck. And so this could have created a opportunity for these people. As we read here, monsoon does, those being the boats. Sailors have harnessed the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds for at least 2 millennia. The Swahili term dough encompasses a diversity of sailing ships, from coastal fishing boats to ocean going vessels. Doughs drew the cosmopolitan urban communities of Indian Ocean world together. The seasonal patterns of monsoons meant that sailors would stay in distant ports for months at a time. They took sojourns in the cities of East Africa and the Horn, the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India, and beyond to China, Sumatra, and Java. Dough routes created intricate loops of cultural exchange, gold and cotton, migrants and merchants, and marriages that tied together people from distant lands. Indian Ocean cities and their citizens continue to reflect the long duration of this cultural dynamism. Now, I want to finish off by saying don't get triggered by slaves. It's true. Slavery did happen in the past, but don't get triggered by it. Because remember, I made a video about how there were, and I wanted to add it in this video, but I realized not a lot of people liked that video. But there were black slaves that went to India and ruled in India at a time. It doesn't matter that they started off as slaves, they ruled. Just be happy about that part. But it tells you how far away Ethiopians went, even as slaves. And that's the final point. That where the Muslims went, anywhere they find Japan, China, which by the way, I should have added that in here because we have Marco Polo talk about Shapangu and how the Muslims go there frequently. Where they went, we went. And it is not true that the slavery was exactly the same at all times. A lot of the times, these people who are called slaves are really just eunuchs who decided to travel with these people. Now, you're probably thinking, why am I saying that? Well, you don't really take real slaves with you on voyages where you could suffer mutiny. So you take people who are loyalists, but don't have the true risk of overturning you. Now, again, this didn't help because, of course, in my video of India, I showed you how Ethiopians eventually got expelled because they kept taking over the kingdoms of Islam in India. And I know some Indians don't like to hear that because I guess there's a fight between Hindu and Muslims, but that's got nothing to do with me. I'm just reporting the history as it is. Anyway, like, share, subscribe. Uh, every time I say like, share, and subscribe, it seems like I get less than that of that, but please do that. Don't forget to, I don't know, anything to help the channel. Thank you.